Thank you very much, Kate. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today in the room or online. So I would also like to issue my birthday wishes to the Parliamentary Budget Office and echo really what Rob and Julian have said. I've been a long-term PBO enthusiast. I'm delighted to be on the advisory committee, and I do think you don't get many significant institutional changes at a national level, and this, I think has been the most significant one of the past decade. It's been incredibly valuable in terms of promoting a better public policy debate, and that is something that I care deeply about. So I was delighted to be invited to speak to you today. I was also delighted actually to be asked to talk about data, which is not something I get to talk about in the abstract very much, but the role of data in making better public policy is something that I do think about a lot in terms of my everyday work and the work of the Grattan Institute, which is really all about building the case for evidence-based policy. So what I want to do today is first of all start with what an extraordinary period we're in terms of data. It really is a golden age in terms of the availability of data, both public and private, which I think just opens up all sorts of possibilities in terms of policy analysis and allows us to answer policy questions we just haven't been able to get to the bottom of in the past. I want to talk about some of the barriers to using data to its full potential. There are still challenges with accessibility and expense in getting to data. The capability within the public service will be critical to get the most out of data. And I'm going to talk a little bit of an adjacent issue, but is very relevant, I think, to the PBO, which is what we do in a world where bad analysis proliferates. And we do know that analysis, particularly from self-interested parties outside, can very effectively sometimes derail policy debates. And then I want to come to how do we unleash this golden age? How do we boost data culture within the public service? How do we think about using private data sets within public policy decision making and some of the roles, particularly for the PBO, in countering poor quality analysis. So you don't see that many genuine exponential curves in real life. We've become familiar with certain ones over the past 2 years and the COVID, but the growth in the volume of data worldwide is absolutely extraordinary. And if you look, even compared to 2010, which doesn't feel too long ago for me, over 160 times as much as we had back then, and all of the projections sort of have that pattern continuing. So data is everywhere. The same is true in the public service. We are now collating, keeping, storing and linking data in ways that hasn't been true in the past. And just want to recognise the phenomenal efforts of the ABS in recent times in building these linked data sets and making them accessible. And absolutely to echo the words of the Chief Statistician there, that the value of this data increases manyfold when you bring together data from disparate policy areas and you can use it to understand better how both individuals and businesses are interacting with the different systems of government. This is my chance to nerd out, as Julian Hill would say. MADEP data set. This is the linked administrative data set which follows individuals and their interactions with government, so we can see how individuals interact with parts of the education system, health system, the tax system, the migration system, and overlay that with demographic information from the census. It's an incredibly powerful tool for policy analysis. On the business side, the BLADE database is effectively the equivalent where we can follow individual businesses and see how they interact. And then there's a number of other administrative sets sitting with particular agencies. So A-Life and Single Touch Payroll sitting with the ATO, and the NISI dataset sitting with the AIHW. It is exciting when you think of all that data. The questions really are endless, and I think it'll be many, many years, longer than my career, before we exhaust all the policy potential of those data sets. Just to give you a flavour of how they're currently being used, The ABS does a fantastic thing, which is to publish all the proposals which are out there using MadeUp and Blabe, so we can see who's using them and what questions they're answering. We have, and this is just a small sample that I've picked because they captured my attention, but we've got federal government doing interesting projects on mental health impacts of bushfires, looking at life lost in heat waves, a fantastic paper which has been published by the Treasury looking at how competition in Australian markets has changed over time. That was not a question we were able to find a strong answer to in the past, as well as its flow-on impacts of productivity growth. We have state governments utilising this data to look at issues around the child protection system, the early childhood education system. And really excitingly, we have academics coming in and using this data to answer policy questions from the outside. So ANU looking at the JobKeeper program, University of Sydney paper looking at a really policy relevant issue around pensions mean test and the impact on labour supply. And why I think, why I'm stressing it's really important to see the academics there. I think we have struggled to get Australian academics to do a lot of Australian policy research, particularly in recent times. A lot of their performance metrics are driven off things like publications in top tier journals. They haven't been particularly interested in publishing work about Australian policy. But what we do know is if you give great data and you can answer interesting questions, then the academics will come. And if you look around some of the top economic journals, there have been huge amounts of data analyses published on the Danish tax system, not particularly because anyone cares about Denmark, more so than any other country, but because they have published the best tax data. So you build the data sets and people will use them. An example from Grattan, we are also enthusiastic users of this data set. This is using the report I'm about to talk about uses the MadeUp data set. It's something we published earlier this year on the skilled migration system. It has long been subject to debate. The way we allocate temporary skill shortage visas are based on occupation lists. They're held within the Department of Home Affairs. They are very bureaucratic in nature, they're not particularly flexible, and they don't really target the high skill migrants that are going to be able to add the most value in the Australian economy. So you can see there we have a lot of high wage and high skilled jobs that are not on these occupation lists. These people cannot get a temporary visa to come in. We also have a lot of low skilled and low wage jobs that are on the list that can get access to these temporary visas. And that has broader implications for the economic and fiscal benefits of the migration program. We can see that occupations are not necessarily a very good way to target skill levels. You can see there is a huge range of pay within occupations. This is all done using MadeUp, which is linking up that migration data with the tax data. Economists have long advocated for a salary threshold instead. So rather than you using a list, we pick a salary threshold and say people can come in if their wages are going to be above that threshold. They can't if they're not. It's very administratively simple, it speeds up the process, and it is a lot better targeted. But a question has always been, well, what is the risks of doing that? We can now use this data to understand who misses out in this world. So again, using MadeUp, linking the tax data and the migration data, we can have a look for different wage thresholds, what percentage of people that are currently granted temporary visas that would miss out under different thresholds. We've advocated for 70,000 under that world. About 35% of existing TSS holders would not get a visa. Where do they work? You can see that most commonly the people that would be rejected under this world are working in the accommodation and food services sectors and the agriculture sectors. They have, occupations like chef have been on the occupation list for as long as people can remember. It's quite difficult to justify that you have a shortage of an occupation like chefs for a decade or more. That tells me maybe that there needs to be an adjustment in wages and conditions in the market. And so, we can see that if we shifted the policy, those are the kind of lower skill jobs that would miss out. The flip side, of course, is assuming we keep the number of visas the same, we'll be bringing in a lot of higher skilled, higher wage workers. And this data allows us to model the fiscal benefits of that as well. So we can see the red bar there shows the uplift in terms of government revenues if we were to shift the system in the way we recommended. And in a world of significant budget pressures, as Stein well knows, an extra $2 billion revenue is definitely worth pursuing. So that's just an example of how we can use these kind of data sets to really drill down on policy problems in the way we haven't been able to in the past. The other phenomenon I just want to touch on quickly is the explosion of private data. It's not a new observation, but if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, companies globally by market cap, a number of the biggest ones now are essentially data companies. If we look at Amazon, we look at Alphabet, the parent company of Google. If we look at Facebook, albeit a little smaller than it was a few weeks ago, all of which essentially derive their value from the data that they have been able to collect on their users. So that has immense private value, but increasingly we are also understanding that some of those data sets can generate significant public value and that they can be used to answer public policy questions. The most obvious example, I think, is during COVID. It became increasingly important in that crisis that we have access to timely data about what was happening in the economy. The ABS did a fantastic job, I think, of moving to very fast surveys to take the pulse of businesses and consumers, but that was complemented by some of these proprietary data sets. By using credit and debit card data to understand what was happening with consumer spending, both in aggregate and how the patterns were shifting, by using Google and Apple mobility data to see changes in the way people were moving around the cities, those things helped shape the health and economic response and were absolutely critical in framing our response to COVID. Barriers to using data, it is still very challenging to access these linked administrative data sets. Obviously, there are significant privacy issues involved when you are linking data sets up, so you have to be a trusted user in order to access them. That is right and appropriate. But beyond that, there are still often very big lags in timeframes in getting access. So I've got a couple of examples from Grattan projects on the right-hand side. That temporary skilled migration project, we initially applied in October. Even though ABS was very quick off the mark, you need to get approval from each of the owners of the data sets that are being linked. If one is slow, it substantially slows down the project. And when you work in small teams, as you do in think tanks or as you do in academia, you normally only have one research project on the go. A 6-month delay in getting data has a huge impact on your research output and productivity, and your willingness to go back and use this data again in future. Data cost is also a barrier. We did some work which I think was really valuable public work in trying to understand out-of-pocket costs for health and how they vary across income levels and for people with chronic conditions. That was $9,000 to get that data. There are other health projects that we would love to do, but frankly are too cost prohibitive. So I think there are broader public interest arguments about why data needs to be affordable. It can also be challenging to work with the data in the data lab environment. I often refer to it as the kind of roller coaster. I think the people that are working in data lab have the highest of highs. You're getting the chance to access extraordinary data that we wouldn't have been able to in the past, but also the lowest of lows as computers crash, files take many days to process, and as questions arise, as they invariably do in these big data sets, an inability to get an answer from the data owners about what a particular variable means or does is important. The second challenge I want to come to is public service capability. This was flagged as early as 2015 in a review by Prime Minister and Cabinet. It is critical with these amazing data sets that we have the people that can use and get the most out of them. And there are challenges in just having enough supply generally of data and analytics capability. This is by and large not just a public sector issue. This is one of the charts I put up at the Jobs and Skills Summit. It comes from work that was done by the Productivity Commission showing that we do lag globally on use of data analytics, AI techniques as a country. And even though things are improving, you can see there more and more job ads, for example, requiring these types of skills or asking for these types of skills, we still lag leading countries like the United States. So more broadly, we have a long way to go, and that has implications for the capability within the public sector. The final challenge I want to come to, as I said, a little bit adjacent to my other points, but I think it is important when we're recognising an institution that has played a role in promoting high quality public policy debate, is that as more data and more analysis happens, we also see a proliferation of bad analysis or self-interested analysis, often sort of black box. So I'm using negative gearing here because that's an example I'm quite familiar with. This was a policy to wind back the ability to write off investment losses, particularly for housing, against taxable income that Labor took to the 2016 and 2019 election. I could easily have chosen climate policy or any number of areas of contentious policies. When these policies are on the table, you get a proliferation of external reports. Often, not always, but often big numbers, sensationalist headings, often, frankly, very poor quality analysis. So I'll pick on this particular one, but it did come out and say this change to negative gearing, which was a $2 billion a year tax rise, would wipe $19 billion a year off GDP. So you don't need much more than a passing familiarity with the tax literature to know that that number must be rubbish. Even, the worst tax, land tax, wipes out about 80 cents in the dollar that it collects. So to say that it's going to have a GDP impact 10 times the size of the tax collection, just doesn't pass the giggle test. But does that stop it? Getting blanket coverage in the media, on the front page of Australia's national newspaper, multi-page spreads in the tabloids. No, it doesn't. The approach that is generally used is to provide this sort of material to journalists on embargo, so they're not able to test it with independent people that may be able to give comments or comment on its credibility. And so it runs unchecked, at least for a period. That flows through to public policy debates, does get picked up. This particular example, it was used by the then Treasurer Scott Morrison, it was mentioned in Parliament. And despite what was then a fairly comprehensive debunking of the work over the next few days, we found that it would come up again and again. So once it takes hold in the public mind, it's quite difficult to counter if you're running behind the 8 ball. So I'm going to come to what I think we can do to reduce the risk of that in a moment. So unleashing the golden age, improving data culture. And when I talk about data culture, what I really mean here is an emphasis on, of course, managing privacy risks. That's incredibly important, but trying as much as possible to put this data out there, to let 1,000 flowers bloom and let it get picked up in analysis. So checking delays that are bureaucratic in nature, recognising the cost of that, particularly on external researchers, is important. I'd love to do a pitch for more funding for Data Lab so they can increase capability and improve data storage. I want to recognise what I think is a really significant step, which has been a long time coming. The Data Availability and Transparency Act will improve the capacity to share data within the public service. I hope the PBO is excited by that. I assume they will be, as well as with academics. I'm not sure if it will apply to Grattan yet, but at the very least, it's nice to see that support the provision of data across those different groups. And I agree with the comments there from the explanatory memorandum. This matters. We are in a data-driven society. We need to be able to use this data to stimulate better policy and innovation in policy. And many of the great minds in productivity think the next big wave of productivity reforms will be in reforming government services. They are a big component of the overall economy. This is the type of analysis that we will need in order to unlock those productivity gains. I wanted to make the point that the data culture that I'm talking about isn't just about those really big data sets. There is data sitting there in all sorts of agencies It is published in reports. It might be published on dashboards. It's sometimes there in Excel spreadsheets. Data culture is about thinking about the end user and trying to make things as accessible and transparent as possible. And I thought it was really wonderful to hear the CBO reflect on the importance of that data transparency and what they do. So that means, putting it out under names that we can recognise, making sure it's machine readable, using consistent methodologies for the naming of series. If you're doing modelling, making code available, and again, it was nice to hear the CBO say that that's the direction they're moving in. All of these are really important steps for transparency. Given I'm talking to the PBO crowd, I went and had a look at the PBO data portal. It's good. It's very clear where the data sits. It's called the data portal. I can see the spreadsheets are nicely named. I go in, the data is clean. To be fair, it is a little bit easier to do that with fiscal data. It's much smaller and neater in nature than many other forms of data. I'm going to pick on the AEC here, but it's not in any way to say that they are the worst or the only culprit. It's just this is a data set that I have to use a lot, so I'm familiar with. But the political donations data is an example of where data culture could be significantly improved. This is an incredibly important data set. We publish who donates over a certain threshold to our political parties, so we can actually see who may be making contributions in order to try and influence politicians and the public debate. So it is very important that this is broadly accessible. Even though it is there in spreadsheets, which is great, it's difficult to find what you're looking for unless you know that you need to go to the detailed receipts CSV. You might otherwise struggle to find where the relevant data is. There is a whole lot of data classification issues, some of which are outside the control of the AEC, but for example, we define a category called other receipts, which includes things we might be interested in, like who's paying to go to fundraisers from politicians, and groups it in with things that we tend not to be interested in, like how much interest they're getting from bank accounts. The data is far from clean. There are missing observations. There are organisations with multiple names, there's spelling mistakes. Grattan as an organisation has invested significant time and energy in producing a clean historical version of this data set, as has the ANU, as has the Guardian. None of this is a particularly efficient way to have access to high quality data. One of my staff members, this data is put out or updated each year, early February, spends the best part of the day on the phone with journalists, not pulling apart the trends and what's interesting in the data, but literally explaining to them how to access it and use it. So if we care about transparency and we want to see things used, thinking about the users and making data as accessible as possible is incredibly important. In terms of public service capability, there are a number of really important initiatives underway that have come out of previous reviews from the Productivity Commission and from Prime Minister and Cabinet. A broader point, I think, is really making the APS a great place to work for data analysts. The government has so much to offer, amazing data sets, important, meaty policy work. We need to make sure that we're doing other things to attract and retain people. So data analysts need the tools, the computing power, access to the packages like R are incredibly important if they're going to do great work. They need to be managed well, and a recognition that data work is not always linear like other forms of work. You can get stuck for long periods, that is normal. Better processes, incredibly important for both the quality of work but also for attracting staff who care about high quality data handling processes. So things like the reproducible analytical pipelines are a growing trend in the UK civil service. I would love to see them come to Australia. It's about how we document and maintain code, how we make that available. And opportunities to publish research is incredibly important as well. So I was delighted to see Treasury Roundup come back, and the first instalment of that had some fantastic pieces of analysis that have been done within Treasury. Wonderful to see those in the public domain. That's important for understanding of what's going on in government, but also important for staff attraction and retention. I'm really excited about the move to potentially build in-house consulting capability within the public service. I think we have seen an outsourcing of a lot of this important work, and bringing that capability in-house and maintaining that human capital within the APS is so important. And I really hope that that builds data and modelling capability. And finally, I want to recognise the role of independent agencies in this type of work. Agencies like the PBO, agencies like the Productivity Commission, have the independence that allows them to ask the right questions, but they also have the resources to do this kind of high quality modelling. And I've appreciated the work done to date, and I look forward to seeing more of it. More of a question than a solution, this one, but I think there, as I said before, there is a lot of public policy value in some of these proprietary data sets. Governments have been quite successful, I think, so far in negotiating access with organisations like banks and other private businesses. And many of them do have a culture of what they call sort of data philanthropy, making data sets available for certain public policy uses. But there is a question in a world where there was particular data sets that governments became reliant on. How do they ensure that they will continue to get access? And is there certain circumstances where we think the public policy value is so high that government should be able to compel or regulate access for certain public policy uses? Finally, to the proliferation of poor quality modelling. I've thought a lot about this. I think something that might help is some sort of broad code of conduct for economic modellers. State governments already publish pretty significant guidelines on cost-benefit analysis and how we do things like wider economic benefits. Could we do something similar that just puts some basic guardrails on products that are coming out? So the sort of things that I would like to see in there, they're not revolutionary. Has there been transparency on key assumptions? And is the methodology clearly detailed? Have modelling code been published where that's applicable? And accountability, have key partners put their name to it. And I do think that sort of transparency around who is actually responsible for the work would focus the mind as to what goes out in the public domain. This is obviously not something that you could require, but governments could ask that of people that are providing modelling services to them. And more generally, it would be useful as a barometer of quality in the public debate. So rather than having to spend time in esoteric debates around assumptions, we would be able to quickly identify whether at least a modelling had met these broad standards of transparency. Last but not least, recognising the role of organisations like the PBO in helping counter this sort of work, not by getting involved in the political fray, of course, but by putting high quality facts and analysis out there to ground debates. So this was true, I think, during the excess franking credits debate. The PBO did some work in response to a request, as is right for it to do, explaining the distributional impacts of the policy by wealth and income. That was a really important counter to some of the claims that were flying around at the time. And the PBO's credibility and the quality of that analysis, I think, helped us have a better and more informed public debate. So, you know, where there is bad analysis, let's counter it with good analysis. The PBO has a role to play, and I think that will be increasingly relevant as we come to what I suspect, unfortunately, is going to be another few years of some pretty challenging policy conversations. So with that, I'm going to conclude. We are in incredibly exciting times as policy analysts and as policy people. The data sets are incredible and are going to allow, I think, an unleashing of questions that we have, you know, always been interested in but never been able to fully appreciate. There are some barriers, I think, to doing the best data work that we can, both within and outside the public service, but they are very surmountable, and I'm certainly very grateful to have organisations like the PBO working in this space, and hopefully for another decade or more to come. Thank you.